This is the Code to Cash podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Code to Cash podcast. This is your host Ajit, and today we have Tohir. He is the Senior Director of Deal Desk and Revenue Operations at SecurityScorecard. So excited for our conversation today, Tohir. Welcome to Code to Cash.
Yeah, thank you, Ajit. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Especially, the theme for today's podcast is to learn all things Deal Desk. But you've had a very storied career in revenue operations. Even before your current role, you've had a stint at Gartner, and there's a company called Datto that you spend a lot of time in.
Yes.
So just, before we get started, would love to learn a little bit about your background, and then we can go more into the functional topics we have in mind for today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, right? Because as with any career, I think for all of us, I kind of landed in a deal desk a little bit by accident. But yeah, as you said before, I kind of started my career in mostly working in family investment offices, private equity VC, been kind of this Excel grunt, right? The analysis needs to be done for the new startup that we're about to invest or acquire. And I worked through this, and eventually through that, the career evolved to me joining Gartner. So managed their FP&A, eventually product, and there got a taste of revenue operations. And Gartner has an amazing structured way of how they manage go-to-market operations. And from then on out at Datto, actually, was the first true deal desk labeled opportunity where essentially got a call from them, had a good conversation with the CRO. CRO said, "Hey, I have this problem. We have a deal desk. We know we want to evolve it. We're not sure what to do with it. Can you go figure it out?" And essentially for the past 5-6 years, including the current company and Datto, I've been managing deal desk functions and trying to build it from just order management to something a lot more complex and interesting that I think that truly should be the definition of the deal desk.
Got it. Awesome. I mean, so I'm just so much looking forward to diving deep into this topic. So I guess my first question is, how does this term mature across companies? Because sometimes you'll have in a smaller company one person helping sellers in close contracts, right? And then there are bigger deal desk teams. I'm curious how you see this function at a small company and how you see this function at a large company, and what are the differences in their responsibility?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So in my experience, exactly as you said, you frequently encounter, especially in the earlier companies, the deal desk function is just an analyst who is processing deals or processing the quotes, and they usually report to a RevOps leader, whether it's a director or VP. And that's pretty much constitutes your deal desk, right? And I think that's normal in my experience because that's traditionally early on for those early stage companies, your goal is to expand, land and expand. You don't really worry too much about, profitability. You don't worry always necessarily about exactly keeping consistent pricing across different product portfolios because you usually have a single product. So it's easy to monitor. But as you alluded to, as the company matures, as you introduce complexity in terms of new products, services, you start thinking about bundle sales, and you just, in general, the type of companies you sell to becomes a lot more complex. You start selling to Fortune 500. They have their own processes for RFP. They have their own processes for how they look at the orders and what they require. The function gets more and more complex. And in the most mature state, and I'll keep it brief and we can dive deeper into how I envision this, but I usually describe most mature deal desk function as this triangle where you have executive teams and strategy at the top, you have a little back office, right? Your accounting, legal, product in one corner, and then sales and success representing go-to-market in the other corner. And the mature deal desk essentially effectively navigates that triangle and consistently passes the information, whether it's a feedback from the field to the execs in the back office policies like SOX compliance, things of that nature to the execs and field. And then if execs has a certain strategy, they trickle it down to the rest of the organization, make sure it's all functions as a cohesive, body that then lends itself on a piece of paper that we send out to the client to sign.
Makes sense. I'm curious from a larger organization perspective, is this mostly interrupt driven? That are you mostly operating in a framework where you're waiting for a seller to ask for help, or is there a more a different mode of operation to deal with?
I have a controversial statement usually on the most mature stage of the deal desk, where I usually say, in the ideal stage, I did my job well for the mature organization where they no longer technically need a deal desk. So essentially, the way it would function is that you would create a set of policies, automation in the systems, and just in general regulations and sales enablement, where the sellers, the managers, they understand what the good deal looks like. And for 95% of the cases, everything is resolved maybe at the regional VP level. But then that 5% is that actually lands with the deal desk team itself, where you essentially go and you escalate and you say, hey, I have this complex, let's use for the namesake, like Tesla. I'm trying to sell to Tesla, but they have a lot of interesting complex asks. What do I do? And then deal desk kind of like rolls up the sleeves, sharpen the pencils, and you go to work to try to structure the deal so that you can go and close that major enterprise account.
Makes sense. I would love to deep dive on that a little bit more. So when you say regional VP, what sort of decision generally, if it's working well, what sort of decision would you expect an RVP to be making on a day-to-day basis?
It's a good question. So we usually, the way I handled it throughout kind of like my career, we set certain level of discounting empowerment, obviously, right? Like you do analysis, you work with the product, you work with FP&A to arrive at a certain target profit margin, right? It can change depending on the maturity, but it essentially kind of like informs then the discounting. And you leave yourself as a deal desk a little bit of margin to operate within, but then the rest of it you essentially give to like a VP, you can give some certain level of empowerment to the managers, and sometimes I even give certain level of empowerment to the sellers if they're experienced enough and they're not going to just, lead with the discounting. So discounting is one part of it. But then as the organization matures, we've actually empowered in the past with finance and legal terms as well. So you set up like a boilerplate language document, what I would call, where you essentially have certain terms that are already pre-approved. And you let the rep basically lift the text and drop it onto the order form on their own. And it's all pre-approved and it's pre-assigned. Or, for example, instead of net 30, you approve net 45 or even maybe net 60, and you give net 45 to the manager, net 60 to the VP. And that way they can cover the legal, they can cover part of finance, and obviously from the discounting perspective, they hopefully understand from your guidance what the good looks like if it's a single product purchase versus a bundled deal.
Okay, got it. So that's the routine case. Completely makes sense. So it mostly seems like discounting authority appropriate to their level, or deal terms that are perhaps more generous deal terms to help close the opportunity. I'm curious what happens in the 5% of cases, right? So how do you make sure that you're trying to close something fast, given that now you have to negotiate finance, you have to negotiate executives, and and how much dependency does a salesperson even create with your team in this case when it comes to you?
Yeah, it's a fun question. That's why I see you smiling, because especially like we're recording this conversation around the end of the quarter. So tension gets high, so to speak, especially around those deals. So I would say there are a few things. One, I would always tell the sellers, and the same goes to the managers and the VPs, I always tell them, for anything that smells complex, there's nothing that's too early. Like the moment you realize like, hey, we're working on this XYZ Fortune 100 account, we anticipate that this is going to be kind of like the initial, product structure that we're going to offer them. I invite them always to come to us, like either schedule a call. We have certain formats that I use where I essentially put together like a deal summary. It's almost like an Amazon style 2-pager, but it essentially allows you to kind of like document the evolution of the deal and all the different parameters you need to keep track of. And then obviously because of my experience of the legal team that you have or the accounting team, we can right away comment, like we can comment from our prior lives. Hey, I sold to this company before. I know exactly they're going to hammer us on these 3 things, right? And you kind of like are starting to pre-approve. From the perspective of obviously expedition or like working through it, it usually depends on the complexity. Like I've had cases where we say closed major retailer, right? One of the largest top 2 retailers in the world. And the entire sales process was like 30 days. Because they came to the table, they knew what they wanted. We already dealt with them in the past, so we kind of knew what they're going to ask for. So it was a very quick and easy process. And vice versa, you can have someone coming from the healthcare, an insurance company coming from the healthcare. And the process there can be very draggy, and it can be a lot of different things that you need to clear. And from that perspective, I think it's really about expectation management. And that's where like Deal Desk has to work also closer with the forecasting team or like with the CRO of the company, just letting them know like, hey, we know you want this deal closed tomorrow, but there's certain sequence of steps that we'll have to clear between our team and their team that'll enable us to kind of like get across the finish line. And it's not a 1 week process. It might be, 6 to 8 weeks process instead.
Got it. When it comes to the type of things that you're being involved in, so I guess one type is approvals of certain discounting or term. Often in my experience in SaaS companies, B2B SaaS companies, there's going to be like non-standard product requirements. So is that generally like, do you try to not handle that, or how do you deal with that? Because I'm guessing a product person has to say, can we do this or can we not do this? And I'm just trying to figure out, is that even deal desk's job to figure out, or is that the salesperson's job to figure out?
Yeah, I'd argue, and again, depends on the organization. I'd argue it does fall in the at least purview of the deal desk, mostly from the perspective of, like, if you let rep go and decide what makes it to the order form, right? Like whatever the client or prospect will request, everything's going to make it there, right? And you essentially have to kind of like what I would call like pump the brakes sometimes and manage the expectations even from that perspective. And the way I see deal desk get involved, like coming back to that kind of like a visual of the triangle I usually draw to people when I talk about deal desk, is that in that like kind of like right corner, I always place legal, accounting, and product. And the reason I place product is exactly for those cases where you have the situation, and I've dealt with it actually recently, like at the end of last year in my current company. We had one client who had very specific requirements, and we ensured from the deal desk perspective, working with legal, that they're documented well, that we're aligned. We had a conversation with their party to just say like, hey, what you see over here is exactly what we're going to deliver. Do you agree? And once that made it to the order, we essentially went and worked with a rep to make sure that they kind of like help us coordinate the signatures, coordinate all the kind of like the steps in the process. And we had product team very actively involved. And I spoke with like product VP to ensure like, hey, this is one of the largest deals we're about to close. We're promising certain things. And in that specific case, because of the size of the deal, the client actually requested certain, what you would call considerations when it comes to us failing to deliver that feature, right? Essentially, we were negotiating between like the cancellation clauses versus refund clause. And those are the kind of things that deal desk gets involved. And I usually try to push for the least, aggressive from our perspective. Say instead of cancellation, maybe I'll offer you some refund, or even refund itself won't be cash refund, but will be credit towards the future purchases. And then you start kind of like negotiation process between ourselves, their party, and the seller helps us coordinate that. And then that ends up kind of like documented on a piece of paper. Then we'll finally go and sign with the client.
I think this highlights for me a question or like a slogan, and then I'll ask the question. There's this slogan or phrase, right? Time kills all deals. And I'm curious, like, how true is that? Can you be, in a 5% of these deals, I'm guessing there is time taken to get the approval, people are traveling, things are happening. How much is time a factor in this case? Or and have you, in your watch, like, have deals been lost if like something got stuck and the seller could not get back to their prospect?
Yeah, trust me. I heard that a lot, and I actually do say it from time to time as well when I try to expedite. There's like a couple of ways by which I can answer this question, right? One perspective is from the, let's give deal desk specific perspective. I kind of like always set expectation with even the folks that I hire is that ideally you can set up spiffs for the sellers. You can set certain rules and benefits for them to bring the deals early to you. Ultimately, and it comes to a lot of vendors and the clients, they know how to play this game as well, and they know if they'll drag out the deal until the very last moment at the end of the quarter, they'll potentially can squeeze the rep for more of a discount, right? So both parties kind of like play that game. And so from deal desk perspective, I was ensuring I kind of set expectations like, hey, the last couple of weeks of the quarter will always be a crunch and will have to be available at any point in time. And that's pretty much what happens to me. It's like I'm on a call, I cover also and help like my VP in APAC, I help my VP in EMEA. So like I start my day with EMEA, I work through the United States, and during the night I have calls with my like reps and managers from Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand, right? And it's normal, and kind of like you set expectations with the team that, hey, this is going to be the case to make sure we don't drag it out and we kind of like be as responsive as possible. But the benefit is then you obviously say like, hey, after we close the books, after everything is done, the entire team can go and disappear for a couple of days. And my sellers usually know Tohir will announce kind of like the blackout on the deal desk. The deal desk will disappear for a few days, and we're going to go kind of like go recharge the batteries. So that's our perspective. But then, like, to your other question in terms of like the deal actually being killed because of the delay, they usually, when I see it happening, it happens because of two factors. One, coming back to the timing, the rep themselves can sometimes drag it out a little bit and not be timely in providing sort of like, hey guys, we need to go and get this deal across the finish line, and kind of like not informing us early enough that we need to go and handle it. So that's one part of it. And the other part can be there's a competitor at play. And that's where it gets interesting, because the competitor can be trying to push for the signature because they put more aggressive terms in front of the prospect.
Mhm.
And that's where, again, it kind of still comes back to the rep in terms of like a rep should always be informed, whichever methodology they use, but they should always be informed in terms of who are we compared against, what is the timeline for that process, how likely are we to succeed, right? So it becomes a lot about how informed we are and how well of a relationship we have with the champion
Got it.
on their side, to make sure we know and understand their timelines.
Makes sense. I'm curious, like you've spent a lot of time in the function. Is there any example, and you can anonymize it, that has been like maybe one of your most stressful or most adventurous examples from your deal desk? It would be very interesting to learn.
I have actually I have a couple, because they can be interesting depending on the situation.
Mhm.
Because I'll give you one example which is more related to like managing the expectations and discounting, and the other one that comes to mind, it's more about when the deal desk can play almost like programmatic role in managing it. And yeah, I'll try to anonymize as much as possible. But for the first case, where it becomes more about kind of like managing expectations internally and externally, we had a deal in one of my prior companies where essentially you're dealing with one of the large insurance companies, have certain set of expectations and kind of like working through the deal. And they had essentially the champion change, right? The person who you're working with, the economic buyer themselves, so something happened, they were phased out, a new person phased in, and essentially that person had a lot more new requirements in place. And it was a big enough deal. It would make or break the year for the couple of reps who were in the deal, as well as the manager. And obviously the tensions were high, right? They are now stressed because of the fact that they have a new person representing the other side, and that new person asking for a lot. And so the rep is like, yeah, let's give them it all. And that's where it becomes very interesting for the deal desk, because you kind of have to play devil's advocate and kind of like almost like ostracize yourself from the company's performance, from your relationship with the field, and say, is this the right thing to do? And it's a tough situation to be, because sometimes coming back to the make or break the year, that might be the difference between the person even being employed at the company, if they were, say, not performing for a certain period of time, and you approving or rejecting it might affect their career at this company, right? Like, it's a tough situation to do, but it's kind of like, the admission ticket for doing all the other fun stuff. Sometimes you have to make those tough calls. And in that specific situation, essentially, I had to like kind of like make a stance and say like, hey, respectfully, I know it's a very tough thing, but like, let's jump on a call. Let's talk through the terms. And the reason why I wanted to use this example, because it's an interesting dynamic for the deal desk leader or even any associate, where I essentially had to go on the call and tell 5 people from like 3 different teams, hey, this is not going to fly. And for the next like 15 minutes, they proceeded basically like yelling at me about like how I'm getting in their way and how this is the worst situation ever. Why am I causing it? No, we're pushing it through, including then leader of that region, right? And I have to kind of like remain calm and say like, hey, this is not going to work. But I have this philosophy where I always say to my team as well, we never say no. We always say no, but. And the but should be followed by a certain solution. And essentially, we start playing around with it, and we ended up kind of like leaving not satisfied, but at least with some game plan in terms of like, hey, let's explore at least a couple of these options. And interestingly enough, like once rep kind of like cooled off, they're like, hey, these are actually manageable options. Let me go and try to figure out and talk with the POC. And the POC respected us pushing back on some of these terms. And we actually ended up landing in a much better place where we originally were, just thanks to the fact that through that conversation, what ended up being, we had to give them a concession of a little bit higher discount, but that gave us room to kind of start pushing for the additional upsell. And the upsell ended up being even more what we gave them on the concessions originally. So it kind of like balanced each other out. So it was like interesting. And it's like representative of your life when sometimes you have to go and get yelled at by a bunch of field, but it's, in a very professional manner. And I always say it's very emotional decision making, and it affects their livelihood. So it's important for the deal desk associate or leader to be very empathetic. So that was one interesting example. And the other one was just in the sense of like programmatic management. We got involved in this process where in that company we used to have hardware and software. And so the hardware was pretty outdated and for one of the product lines. And essentially no one knew how to get rid of it. And then it was right around the time when I joined the team and they were like, hey, he's a new guy. He probably can go and figure out how to solve it. And so the product leader came to me with like a grin on his face. It's like, hey, I heard you're like the solution to my problem. And the reason why it was a problem, it was outdated hardware that wasn't patched regularly. So there was some security exposure because of the fact that it was not updated on the software side. And essentially we had to go and like figure out for like a year, they couldn't figure it out. And now we had on a very short term basis, have to go and design a program that tells reps how to handle the negotiation in a very careful manner with the client, what to offer them from the pricing perspective and solution perspective. And then make sure there is a process internally to quickly and expeditiously kind of like approve it so that it doesn't get stuck somewhere in the approval process. It's like, hey, if you're following this direction of the program, you're automatically approved. Just go sign the order, ship them the new hardware, put them on the new hardware, get them in a nice clean shape. I describe it in like 30 seconds, but it was essentially almost like a 3-month process to design this whole thing. And there was, again, a lot of tensions around like, hey, we're not meeting our margin expectations, but it's like, who cares about the margins? Like, let's get the faulty hardware out of there, right? Or potentially faulty hardware out there because it's so outdated. And then the other part of it was obviously like managing the expectations with the reps, because the reps are like, hey, but how will it work if I'll set the wrong expectations from the pricing perspective? If the client feels like they need to do a lot of work to replace the hardware, so you have to kind of like create the escalations and certain concessions to say like, hey, we're going to come and we're going to help you work through this process. So again, pretty complex. I think overall the entire program took like another 6 months plus like 3 months of execution to get it all completed. But again, another example where deal desk can become this like cohesive, well, almost like, carbon fiber connecting different dots of field of executive direction to retire the product, and then working with the product to figure out like technologically, how can we track, how we can report, how can we make sure every single device that we retired was fully disconnected and the new device was activated. So it was an interesting experience. And again, not necessarily a quintessential deal approval, but in my opinion, deal approvals and like managing some of these more complex negotiations sometimes can be admission ticket price to do some of this fun programmatic work that helps mature the entire organization.
Got it. Interesting. I want to switch a little bit into systems. So in the world of deal desk, I guess there's quoting systems, there's billing systems. Which systems do you tend to interface with more? And do they like what works in a real life situation? Are the systems need to have? Are they necessary evil, but you don't like them? I'm just curious what your take is on some of this technology.
Yeah. I like putting things in buckets for better or worse. The three, I think, systems that Deal Desk most regularly kind of like operates within, right, is some sort of CRM, right? And the CRM primarily from the perspective of opportunity management and frequently approval management. Then there's any kind of like workflow automation tools. There are a couple of there's one specific workflow automation tool that I really like to use, and I've used it for a couple of companies now, and it helps you kind of like expedite and remove some pressures from the CRM system. In case like Salesforce is a very popular CRM system, it can be very good with automation, but up until a certain extent, when it gets a little bit too complex, it can actually put a lot of burden to manage from the perspective of your developers. And so sometimes it's nice to have the workflow automation tool behind Salesforce to kind of like ease the process, and at the same time also take over a little bit parts of it, so that as a deal desk you can go and you can say, hey, approvals can be tweaked immediately, versus I have to submit a ticket in Jira and it's going to take like 2 weeks until the next sprint, and if we make it to the next sprint, it's another 2 weeks until the change actually deployed. It's much easier for you to control. And then obviously the CPQ system, and CPQ is ideally you solve as much as possible within the first two systems. So the CPQ's process is really just about issuing the quotes, ingesting the quotes, and passing information to the finance and accounting, so that they can do the rev rec, they can do the booking, they can do the invoicing, and kind of like work through those parts of the process. But I would say all of them are necessary. You kind of, you need a clean CPQ to make sure you're aligned with accounting. You need a very, hopefully, nice working workflows behind the approval, so that approvals can be as complex as you need them to be, but as simple for the rep to interact. Ideally, rep just submits one single request, and the workflow kind of like decides who needs to see it. And then from the Salesforce perspective or CRM, you need point of record to make sure if you're going public, You want to meet SOX compliance, you have a single point of record where you record all the approvals workflows, because that's required for you to be to pass any SOX compliance.
Interesting. So you have to document why an approval was made for SOX compliance? Okay.
Yeah. Essentially, like with that, I was leading pretty much all the commercial efforts going public. And as we're working with different auditors, essentially you need to have two things. You either need to have a very well documented route for approval around the decision on the discounting, or you need to have a document explaining why it was auto-approved. So essentially, if you have like a promotion, you need a very clear documented promotion that you provide to them to say, like, here's why this deal was approved. And if the deal did not follow this particular approval, you need to have an approval flow shows, hey, this is this discount, so it's this person needed to approve and this person approved it. So it's like relatively straightforward to pass it, just a little bit cumbersome to make sure you have everything documented, which is going public. Going public is just filling up a lot of paperwork.
Makes sense. Okay, so something more contemporary question for nowadays, right? So the AI and generative AI is making a lot of news. Is there a role for AI in the deal desk function?
It's interesting. It's actually a hot topic even for me, because something I've been kind of like debating about for a little while. The challenge, so I think short answer is yes. Like, I think it's something, it's like any other tool, right? Like in the past, people used to process contracts on a piece of paper. And then eventually we had to go and transition to like a DocuSign, or we had to have like CPQ to issue the quotes. And I'm sure someone was uncomfortable and they were like, no, but I love to have my like Rolodex or whatever over here so I can like file it, and they have to get comfortable. I feel like AI is in the same bucket of like any, large learning algorithms or any kind of like automation. Like you kind of have to figure out the way to apply it. The challenge that I've seen so far for our use case is that privacy of the data, really, right? Because that's something important to us. Like, sure, I can go and potentially analyze the deal by like ingesting and pushing a lot of the information to like ChatGPT or Google Gemini, but like, is the data stored? And it's stored and used for other modeling. There's a lot of like security components to it. That's one piece. And the other piece, excuse me, I like operate for most of my career in like international companies, and from region to region, the laws can be very different. Like right now, AI is more of a factor for us to structure the agreements and our USA or EULA with international companies, right? Because a lot of like European companies now ask for it. So like my legal team complains to me frequently. They're like, it just like kills us. We're still trying to figure out how it all works, and we need to include it. But from the technology perspective, I definitely think it's a place. It's just the privacy and the legal matters what slows it down right now. The way I see it in the future, I had this like internal debate in my head, and I'm yet to have a good answer to it. But it's like there must be a way to create almost like a golden score for what the good deal looks like, right? Because deals can be very complex and it can have a lot of parameters. And there's probably some sort of algorithmic approach that you can take to say, as long as you hit X number of parameters and they give you a certain level of score, that almost like becomes your golden score to push it through the approval, right? We can talk about like pricing curves and how I think about it, but it's like you'll never have perfect deal. There will always be some concession, but there's probably some trade-offs, and you can potentially get algorithm or some sort of like learning, like machine learning, right? Software ingest that data and kind of like spit out like, hey, here's what the summary of it is. And I think that's probably going to be the next best application before you get to the points of like, I can see for the reps it being more of a quotation facilitation. Like, hey, I need this deal of this structure with these terms, go assemble for me the quote. Like I can see that can be a next application for it, but it's maybe a little bit more sales ops and deal desk management versus purely deal desk management process.
I'm curious actually about this thing, the last part that you mentioned, right? Like seller can say, hey, I want this. What is an example of, like, would this really even work? And what is an example of what a seller would want to ask?
It's actually, it will, because the hot topic that you usually face whenever you work with the sales enablement teams, at some point in time, if you're a deal desk manager or like if you're a CRO or VP, you're listening to this podcast, right? Like at some point, someone will say, hey, let's create a deal calculator. I want to have an application where the rep can come in, say, I want this product, this terms, spit out for me the best assembled deal based on these parameters. So this is where I can see it. And the challenge usually with this kind of calculators that I see from like talking to reps is that you still kind of have to be very much up to speed on a lot of this minutiae. And in some cases, like transparently, reps don't have time sometimes to learn every single like legal term and what does it mean. Eventually they do, but if you're early in the career, it's hard for you to tell them apart. And that's where like I can see this kind of like management system being, hey, in a very natural language, tell me as a rep what you're trying to do. and let me offer you multiple options. And maybe it's a combination of like the algorithm and like a chatbot that essentially, instead of a deal desk associate, coming back to my point about eventually, like, you should not really need deal desk for 95% of the interactions. Chatbot becomes that interaction of like, hey, but have you thought about this product? Oh, I'm sorry, for this size of the deal, this legal term is not applicable because it's way too aggressive. You should offer this. Are you okay with this? Yes, I'm okay. And maybe that all trickles into like final order form that the rep receives. And who knows, you can probably bake in the approvals on the back end and say, as long as they fit these parameters, tell them you're all approved, you're all set, have a good day. Or tell them, hey, this is great, but now it was submitted for the deal desk to approve because it's way too aggressive.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, on the second side, like, tell me what you think about this. So let's say you are not sure as an executive, leadership team, what you want to approve. Because I've been in situations where my old CEO, right after COVID, he started approving everything himself. And that pissed off my sales team because they did not want to talk to the CEO. And so what they started to do is they would increase the price by like 50% so that they can give a discount and not have him brought in. And so, his implementation fees, like, he just put some insane fees in there. So I'm just curious, like, could it work if you say, listen, there is no policy, the policy is you decide, and you let the policy, him or her, you let them do their thing for a quarter, and then the AI says, now I figured out what you like and what you don't like, and we're just going to use that. And since I know, I'll just tell you, like, does this fall under your parameters, or does this fall out of what you would approve? I'm curious. First of all, or is it just me encountered these situations?
So no, I haven't counted them. And the way I usually, and again, right, I'm sure a lot of your audience kind of like consists of the executives of different levels, different parts, right, like CFOs, CROs, CEOs of the organizations. And they'll be the first one to tell you, like, they're not always as close enough to the field to really know all this minutia, right? Like, I tell it to any CEO I work with, like, hey, the information you even hear from the client is different from the client is comfortable to tell to your rep. And the same kind of like trickles through the entire organization. So my hesitation there would be to say there are certain inherited biases based on the best available information for that C-suite executive that will impair their decision making. It might seem good in the moment, but like, I always debate, and I always like to keep emotions as much as possible out of the decision making, right? Like, you as an organization can determine, for example, what products do we want to focus on? Like, we know we're going to retire this product, so let's try to sell less of this product, but increase the sales for the other product. From FP&A perspective, you should, as a good FP&A team, you should have an answer to the question of like, what do you want to be your operating margins? Like, what do you want to be operating margins wise? Because then you can build the model off of that to say, like, what your product margins should be, right? And you can go work with product to identify what your COGS are and have a rough model behind it. And essentially you have some sort of like quantitative input, you have some sort of like qualitative input in terms of, hey, what is our strategy long term and what areas we want to focus on? And I much rather those things to affect the decision making, kind of like an algorithm of what the approval should look like, right? Versus the opinion of individual, because I've had those situations before. And when I try to talk to a few reps every week. That's my kind of like rule of thumb, to just like check in, say how things are going, what do you like, what you don't like. And one thing every single rep would mention is that they don't like inconsistency of the decision making, right? They always want to make sure that they'll be able to predict what will be the answer even before they hit that submit for approval button. And being very programmatic about it allows you to tell them very clearly, hey, this is what you need to hit to make it a good deal versus like amberish yellow deal. And my always hesitation when personality gets involved, you lose that ability, because I've had those comments before. It's like, hey, depending on whether this leader is in a good mood, I'm going to get a yes on a deal. On the same deal, I'm going to get a no if they woke up on the wrong side of the bed, which makes it an inconsistent approach. And I'm a big fan of consistency, being an ops guy. So I'm like, how can I bake it into the process to begin with so it's easy to understand? You know what you're going to expect. And for those 5%, we're going to have a very polite and professional discussion about why we will or will not do that deal.
Makes sense. Awesome. So those are most of my questions, Tohir. Is there any question that I should ask you that I have not?
Oh, let me think. It's a fascinating space.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's a question. It's more kind of like maybe my guiding principle for like anyone who listens just from the perspective of leading the deal desk. There's this interesting question around like where the deal desk should reside. that I've encountered that before, right? Because the argument can be deal desk should be part of the finance organization because you deal with margins, like you work kind of like you impact the financial performance. On the other side, you can say, hey, you should be part of the CRO organization because you're very closely related to the go-to-market, right? And I honestly, it's funny, like I pose this question, but I also kind of like will give you like, hey, it depends. Because I actually noticed that it depends on the maturity of organization where you place the deal desk. Like early on in its life, the life of the company, it kind of makes sense for this to be function within the FP&A, mostly because go-to-market, they would want to sell everything, right? If it's a deal, if it's a prospect, it's a yes, let's give them whatever they want, let's put it in because it's a revenue. But then you kind of like hit that concept of responsible growth, where you essentially need to start thinking, hey, will this deal be a lot of maintenance for us, right? Because it's a very complex client. Our success will have to talk to them daily, and it's going to take a lot of capacity from them. Margin-wise, are we in good shape? Legally, are we getting exposed because we promised way too much? Accounting, will it be very hard to rev rec and invoice, and accounting will be bogged down? So you kind of like make sense for it to be there, kind of like in the FP&A early on, because you become almost like automatic, this like control of the valve. But then as I think organization matures and as you kind of like ingest and you educate the leaders within the go-to-market about what the good deal looks like, I actually don't mind the deal desk transitioning over to the CRO organization. I've reported to the CRO before as a deal desk leader, because then you can have an informative conversation with the CRO in terms of like regional strategies around like, okay, what kind of products are we pushing through the CPO? And then finance almost becomes your input from the margin perspective, but you're not necessarily worried too much about all these other processes because you already matured them, you developed them, and now you really focus on, hey, what kind of promotions are we putting out? We have an event coming up. Do we want to have some sort of like special event promotion, and how do we trigger it and how do we activate? And you remove a lot of friction for this kind of decision making when you place the deal desk closer to the CRO and kind of like working with the CRO, because in a more mature like public company, with all respect to all amazing CFOs I worked at, CFOs will really see it just by the numbers of like, does it look good? Does it look bad? Right? Where within the CRO world, you realize it's always this kind of like what I call it, like you draw this pricing or like profit margin curve, and no manager will perfectly follow it, right? You will always have managers kind of like playing hopscotch and like jumping around it or jump rope around this line. And CFOs are not comfortable with it always, and it annoys them. So even reporting to the CRO will understand this, and you'll be able to create a dynamic with the leadership to say like, hey, we're going to give them some margin of variation off of that trend line that we're setting up, so that numerically we can slap them on the wrist if they veer off too far away from it. But at the same time, we have the flexibility, and we don't annoy the CFO because the CFO have to see it and they don't get it because they're like, why can't you just set them down on the straight path? And it's like, it's a deal making. You kind of have to ebb and flow sometimes. So there's this always interesting debate. It's like, I like to discuss sometimes with like even CFOs and CROs of other companies I know, because as I said, it's not a clear cut answer, but it's something you kind of like transition, I think, depending on the maturity of your organization.
Completely. Well, those were all of my questions, and super informative podcast and guidance. So thank you, Tohir. Thank you so much for your time. Really loved having you on.
No, likewise, Ajay, thank you for inviting. And as I said, deal desk is fun. It's like underappreciated unsung heroes. You get besides time kills deals, the other thing that people like to say, like deal prevention desk. Which I'm like, hey, it's not like that. It's not like that. We're friendly. We don't bite. But I think it really comes down to being empathetic, being very transparent, always, like as I said, no but, kind of like being very cooperative with the field, not trying to just be very strict, because as I said, like deal making can get very emotional. So extract as much as emotion possible, and keep it fun. As I said, even at the end of the quarter, it can be stressful, but at the end of the day, you get that rush of, closing deals and hitting the quotas for your reps. So it's a fun role. I highly recommend, if anyone ever considers any kind of like other exploratory RevOps roles, check out Deal Desk. Deal Desk is a fun option.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.